Hey everyone, this is week 6 of close readings in Isaiah. I think this is the last week that we have them. So for this week, we're going to jump into Isaiah 7. It's not the longest chapter. It's got some very interesting context to it, I feel like. So we're just going to jump in to some history about what's going on. This chapter in particular, we can tell a lot about the historical context based off of the first couple verses in there. It's at the time of King Ahaz. This is, in a time period where we have King Ahaz, and then we have like Syria and Israel. They're all Jerusalem's basically under attack by its enemy nations, and there's some other alliances that are going on against Jerusalem at this time as well. So it's in a time of war is really when this is taking place, as we kind of can read from that. So this chapter is based off of the literary context of Isaiah going and speaking to King Ahaz in this time period. Like I said, which puts this chapter in kind of a weird spot because it's not necessarily part of the judgment. It's really like the first we kind of see of the active preaching and active prophesying, I just couldn't think of the word, over the rest of this book. This is kind of the first we are starting to see of this from Isaiah. So this is in a time of war. It's at literary wise, it's after this kind of conversion of Isaiah's mindset of being torn down by God versus, preaching this message that they're going to be judged and that they're going to have, somebody else who's coming later, and all that stuff kind of gets explained, that Jesus is kind of hinted to in this chapter a little bit later as well. But this is kind of the first we're seeing of this transition of his mindset based off of the vision that he had in God's temple just beforehand. So now this is in that transition part for him, and it's an interesting time period because of the time of war, and his words obviously not going to be accepted well in a time of war for the nation, because they're probably looking for more practical things to them that they might be looking at. So he already kind of knows that his words kind of just going to get shot down and people aren't going to agree with him. So that's kind of where we're at with those two. Jumping over to some poetic language. There is minimal metaphors used here. I wouldn't say that this is a very poetic chapter at all. I think that it's a very almost logistical chapter in a sense of kind of breaking into this new world, a new mindset that Isaiah is in. Like I said, about prophesying this new message to the people. Themes in this chapter are definitely conflict and war, and also hope as well. I think those three are the main things, because we have conflict and war happening in the earlier chapters, and then we go like the earlier verses in chapter 7, and we go down to like the later verses or middle verses, like in 15 and on, where we're given this new message of Jesus, and we're given this whole message from 18 to 25, really, of this new mindset and this new way of thinking about the world and what things are going to be like after God has this, this redemptive plan kind of comes to fruition. Some Old Testament and New Testament parallels. I think that when you look at like I said, that same verse of 15 where you're talking about curds of honey, the verse reads, curds and honey, he shall eat them. He may know how to refuse to the evil and choose the good. One thing that I found out super interesting about this is because I made a connection to like Jeremiah 32 and Exodus 33, and there's a few other times in Numbers, I think 17, where we're given this depiction of the Holy Land of, milk and honey. It's this great place, and that's kind of what has been being prophesied in visions of this promised land that they're going to eventually try and get to. And I just thought that it was a really cool connection. Not only is this a connection obviously pointing to the New Testament and pointing to the gospel of Jesus, it also has, I believe, an underlying tone of a description of, of what Jesus is like in conjunction with the promised land, bases off of, the promised land is a location, but Jesus is, our salvation. The end location is obviously to go to heaven. And I think that using this same terminology of curds and honey, obviously curds are a byproduct of milk being curdled. And I don't know if I could have overlooked that, that coincidence of the description of Jesus and in this case, it wasn't necessarily a Jesus, it was Emmanuel. That description versus the description that we see in the Promised Land. There's a very interesting parallel that I think that you could, take some personal time to kind of decipher and look into, to see what that can be telling us. But I thought that was really cool. As far as, an application that we can take modernly from this, like I said, I think it's kind of a logistical thing for that time period. I do think that is one thing that can be taken into consideration a lot to kind of understand, the nature of Jesus and what he is versus, him being for our salvation versus, him being in a place that is a promised land kind of aspect, because I think that it can be a very tough mindset to understand that there's not really going to be a place in this world that is comparable, but at the same time, using the same kind of words to describe Jesus as a place, I think that there's a really interesting connection that we can make, and something that we can take from that is that, it's not necessarily looking at a place, it's looking at Jesus, but Jesus can be reflected by the place, but that's not where the important part is, because it's never about the location, it's about the underlying principle, it's about God, it's about, the presence of Jesus in that place. And I think that especially with that presence of Jesus is being described as, what he's going to eat, and I think that was a really interesting thing, unless I'm looking too much into that. But that's something that I thought I took away from it, and I think that could be a modern application of just kind of looking at how God treats his people, how, in times of war, the message that's being spoken, in a time of disaster. So, yeah, I think that in that later half, we see a lot about the description of a place versus a description of Jesus and what he is, and I think that where your mindset is with that can be important based off of if you're looking at it from, a worldly aspect versus spiritual aspect. So I think that's something that was cool that I was able to kind of take from that. So hope you enjoyed. Maybe you learned something. You guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Anyone who watched this,